Well now, the next couple of months I'm going to intersperse our haiku and senryu podcasts with podcasts about tanka, because we're going to have a go at writing them in November 2024. If you're in my mailing, you'll know that I had a bit of a spill on my bike, a nasty one, which left my old bonce a bit battered. And I'm having to take things a bit slower, so I've amended the schedule of submissions, and the podcasts might not be as long as usual because editing is giving me a bit of a headache. But hopefully you'll still enjoy them and be inspired to write. For those of you who are new here, I'm Patricia and this is the Poetry Pcast. You are most welcome. Today we're going to make a start on tanka. I'm looking at the premodern period, so a poetry type known as Waka, composed before the tanka reforms of the late 1800s, early 1900s. By the end of this podcast, you should know a bit about the history of Waka and see the development of the form in this pre-tanka world. I think it begins to look like something we might just recognise in contemporary work. Don't worry if you don't immediately get them. We'll look at them again. Now, when I started learning haiku, I turned to Jane Reichold and her book, Writing and Enjoying Haiku, a hands-on guide to help me get the basics. Well, I thought that as this is the beginning of our look at tanka, I'd go straight to Jane and see what she had to say. She reminded me what we already knew, that tanka descends from Chinese poetry, evolving from there through Waka to tanka. Waka, put very simply, is a short form of poetry, thought of in Western terms as a 31-syllable poem. Don't forget, the syllable is a Western construct which does not exactly translate into Japanese. They talk in terms of ons. But it is a simple way for us to describe and understand the on. The waka is generally thought of as taking the form 5-7-5-7-7, with a caesura or pause usually coming at the end of the third line, but not always. After that pause, the final two lines are a link and shift, adding a little something extra to the overall poem, much like the renga or renku verses we've looked at in the past. At least, that's what Jane tells me. Stick with me though, that might not always be the case. You might notice something as I read this week's poetry. Have a listen to where I've put the pauses. We'll come back to the form, the pauses, in a future podcast. For now, let's have a little listen to the evolution of Waka poetry. Over the rapids of rock-raging Tarumi, the fern sprouts burst out. It seems now that spring has finally arrived. Over the rapids of rock-raging Tarumi, the fern sprouts burst out. It seems now that spring has finally arrived. And that's by Prince Shiki, who died in the early 700s. And it's taken from the Manyu Shu, Book 8, translated by William J. Higginson. And Higginson suggests that these early Manyu Shu poems suggest an immediacy which is missing from later poems. And although we can assume that this is composed by someone from the higher echelons of society, he is a prince after all, the poem still retains a countryside feel, different to that of later poetry. Waka was, at least for most of the period we're looking at today, the province of the courts and courtiers. By courts, I mean the royal courts. Over time, the form became more lyrical. These poets worked to refine their language and metaphor and achieve courtly types of beauty, favouring elegance, harmony, and subtle humour. A poem by an anonymous poet, this time from the later anthologies of poetry, The Cock and Shoe, which dates from around 905, so about 200 years later than the previous poem. The plovers living on the strands of Sashide by Shio Mountain cry out, "May our Lord reign for 8,000 years." The plovers living on the strands of Shashide by Shio Mountain cry out, "May our Lord reign for 8,000 years." It's a little tongue twistery for me, but anyway, it's an anonymous poem, and it's taken from Cock and Shoe, Book 7, also translated by William J. Higginson. Again, there's a seasonal element, the plover being a traditional winter kigo, but the emphasis has changed, hasn't it? In the first, the poet is speaking about nature. In the second, the courtly poem, the poet is now using nature as a subject, but also in a metaphorical sense. The plover, according to Higginson, cry for 1,000 years, and here the poet, obviously in an attempt to flatter his lordship, suggests an amplification of their cry. Personally, I prefer the first. I find it more authentic. But then, of course, I'm from peasant stock. What do you think? Later still, I have a poem from the Shin Kokinshu, compiled at the beginning of the 13th century. As I look out, the foothills are hazy at Minaze River. What makes me think, for evenings it's autumn? As I look out, the foothills are hazy at Minaze River. What makes me think, for evenings it's autumn? And this one's by an ex-emperor, no less, ex-emperor Gotoba, who lived till around 1239. And it's from the Shin Kokinshu Book 1, translated by William J. Higginson again. And on the face of it, it's quite a simple poem. And Higginson suggests that the poet is challenging conventional poetry wisdom of the time, which would describe spring dawn or autumn evenings as the most attractive time of day. Whereas the poem is looking out on a spring evening. And so Higginson feels that the ex-emperor is contradicting those poetry norms. So anyway, you can see the progression in these poems, can't you? The original poem in content and composition is much the simpler of the three I've read so far. No illusion, no courtly grace and favours. So I'll read them again so you get them in turn. Over the rapids of rock-raging Tarumi, the fern sprouts burst out. It seems now that spring has finally arrived. The plovers living on the strands of Sashide by Shio Mountain cry out, "May our Lord reign for 8,000 years." As I look out, the foothills are hazy at Minaze River. What makes me think, for evenings it's autumn? And if you want to follow these bits of poetry, there will be an essay out at some point in the Tanka series. I'll let you know in a mailing. If you're not on the mailing, sign up now or you'll miss out. As time progressed, the poets have had to push boundaries within the restrictions imposed on the Waka form. Restrictions like the number of on or the language that can be used within the poem. And according to Shirane, they used various devices such as classical illusion, wordplay, and symbolism to great effect, at least up until the time of the Shin Kokinshu. So that's about the 13th century. They use these devices to maximize the dramatic effect of their poetry and to be original in what they're writing. So between the time of the Shinkokushu and the late Edo period, it's quite difficult to find waka of merit to read to you. In fairness, I probably haven't got the right books in my library, but there are other reasons why waka of this period are hard to come by. If you remember from the podcast I did on the history of haiku, a link in the show notes, of course, other forms of literature and entertainment were becoming very popular, such as no plays, renga, puppet theatre, and of course, our beloved haiku. These literary forms were of increasing popularity, quite possibly because the more common folk were involved in their composition, but also because the writing of waka was becoming ever more problematical. Those restrictions again, you see. These restrictions meant that talented poets tried their hand at other forms of writing, and those that remained were often writing somewhat tired poems. Sweeping generalization, I know, but you get the idea. Boundaries had been pushed to limits, and originality was becoming difficult to come by. Now that's one view. Another view would be given by Stephen Carter, who maintained that renga masters such as Shinkai and Soji of the 15th century would probably have insisted that their age was in every way an extension of the great waka ages of the past. This is due to waka being the most dominant form of literature in elite society. There is quantity of waka during this period, but renga, or renku, which was looked down upon by the courtly poets, is now acknowledged to have had the artistic quality. There are, of course, outliers. In this first poem I'm going to read you by Socho, we have a poet writing the 31-syllable verse, but breaking the wording restrictions of traditional waka using colloquial language. This is easy on the ears. Listening this evening to the voices of village children singing rice-husking songs. This is easy on the ears. Listening this evening to the voices of village children singing rice-husking songs. By Sochu, and he lived till 1532. I don't know who translated that, I'm sorry. In the second poem, this time by Shinkai, the poet departs from traditional topics of waka. This is the end of those who cut down men with the sword, to stand as firewood along the path over the mountain of death. This is the end of those who cut down men with the sword, to stand as firewood along the path over the mountain of death. And that's from around 1471. Again, I don't know who translated it. So I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to question, are these last few waka, or is this haikai? Are we beginning to see a waka revolution? From the 17th century, the composition and traditions of waka were noticeably challenged. The composition is still primarily in the hands of courtly poets, but it's being challenged by common scholars, and the writing of waka becomes more universal. Remember, the literacy of the Japanese population was one of the highest in the world. So these more common folk rebelled somewhat against the lyrical poetry of the courtly poets. And this rebellion might be summed up by the poet Toda Mosui in this poem. Plough it back to its ancient state. How narrow the way of poetry has become. Plough it back to its ancient state. How narrow the way of poetry has become. And Toda Mosui died in the early 1700s. Again, really sorry, don't know who translated this, but there are citations that you can follow up in the essay that I'll write. So Toda Mosui advocated for all classes of Japanese people to be able to compose waka. He and many others were influenced by the Manyoshu. They preferred to write about everyday topics that most folk could understand and identify with in the language of the everyday. All very haiku-esque, no? So one of the leading poet-philosophers of the 18th century, Motori Norinaga, was a proponent of mono no aware. That's the awareness of the transience of things. We've had a look at it in the past. He felt that the creation of poetry was a nearly involuntary response made by sensitive persons when they come to know mono no aware. That the creation of poetry was not for the poet alone, but only came into its own when readers were able to feel the emotion that moved the poet. I like that acknowledgement of the importance of our readers. Don't we always say there are two of us in this poetry lark? The one who writes, the one who reads. Anyway, let's hear a poem by Motori Norinaga, who died in 1801. This time it's translated by Michael F. Mara. How many springs now has it lasted through, watching its reflection, the deeply moving willow tree by the river? How many springs now has it lasted through, watching its reflection, the deeply moving willow tree by the river? So I have some more characteristics of the changing face of Waka at this time. There was a movement away from lyricism towards descriptiveness. You may already have noticed. The fierce roar of the wind echoing through the deep forest of Uzumasa, autumn dusk. The fierce roar of the wind echoing through the deep forest of Uzumasa, autumn dusk. That's by Ozawa Roan, this time translated by Peter Flukiger. Faint trickle of mossy water from a crevice in the mountain rock. The clear, still way I pass through the world. Faint trickle of mossy water from a crevice in the mountain rock. The clear, still way I pass through the world. Ryokan died in 1831, and that's translated by Burton Watson. Another characteristic is the miniaturization of focus, illustrated by the next poem. Notice how it focuses in, like zooming in on your camera these days. The waterfowl are now gone without a trace. Above the river a single feather dances in mid-air, never quite falling. The waterfowl are now gone without a trace. Above the river a single feather dances in mid-air, never quite falling. Okuma Kotomichi, who died in 1867. Don't know who translated that. I've got a few more poems by him that'll illustrate some more characteristics. For example, the merging of the aesthetics of haiku with that of waka. So a move away from the elegant language of the court to the language of everyday life. Sleeping on the mother's back, the pinwheel spins even in the baby's unconscious hand. Sleeping on the mother's back, the pinwheel spins even in the baby's unconscious hand. Okuma Kotomichi. Though few days have passed since the willow slips were put in the earth, young children pull them up to see where the roots have formed. Though few days have passed since the willow slips were put in the earth, young children pull them up to see whether roots have formed. Okuma Kotomichi. And last but not least, the composition of waka on one single topic. I've forgotten my begging bowl, but no one would take it. No one would take it. How sad for my begging bowl. I've forgotten my begging bowl, but no one would take it. No one would take it. How sad for my begging bowl. Ryokan, translated by Burton Watson. Stark naked, the men crowd forward, flailing hammers to smash lumps of ore. Stark naked, the men crowd forward, flailing hammers to smash lumps of ore. Tachibana Akimi, translated by Burton Watson. As an aside to that, it's thanks to Shiki that the work of Tachibana Akimi, who was known only to people within his own district while alive, became famous. Shiki wrote of him that he learned from the Manyoshu and went beyond the Manyoshu. With regard to sight, sound, and touch, there is nothing that he does not include in his 31 syllables. And he illustrated another development of the age, the writing of Waka sequences. But that's another topic for another day. But I do have an example that he wrote after visiting a mine. Deep in the mountain caves where no sun rays reach, they enter, torches flaming, digging out metal. Stark naked, the men crowd forward, flailing hammers to smash lumps of ore. Deep in the mountain caves where no sun rays reach, they enter, torches flaming, digging out metal. Stark naked, the men crowd forward, flailing hammers to smash lumps of ore. And as I said, that's Tachibana Akimi, translated by Burton Watson. These last few poems illustrate the development of Waka pre-reform. It's becoming more, shall we say, true to life rather than lyrical. Modern tanka poets can probably see that these poems have more in common with contemporary tanka than the lofty lyrical verses by the court poets. And so that might be a good place to stop. And next week, we can have a look at what tanka reform brings. See you again next week then, for a bit more tanka. Until then, keep writing. Now, as I said, this is the first part of a longer essay, which will be available once I put together all the tanka podcasts for this 7th season. If you're on the mailing list, I'll let you know when it's ready. If you're listening to the podcasts, I'll make it obvious that I've finished and you should be able to read it. And if you're coming late to the party, then please go to the shop or my Buy Me a Coffee and purchase the essay. Of course, ISA and Busan members will automatically receive the essay. If you want to be one of those lucky members, then you can find out details of how to sponsor the podcast with a membership on the Poetry P website. All in the show notes. Ciao!